Good afternoon and welcome back to Smart Cities. Today we talk about complexity science and cities as complex systems. Cities are not normally seen as complex systems. You will find that's a specialty in recent years or recent decades. Much more an example of complex systems is, for example, the weather. And if you can imagine, this is really not explainable why it is so hot these days in this November. But that's one of the specialties of complex systems, as you will see. But we want to put this in the context of our whole lecture series. So it's the complexity science, which is at the center, as a follow-up to urban science, which we had last Monday, and cities as complex systems as a specific contribution. The story so far, we had last time citizen design science that could close the gap between science and city, the development of new cities. And today, as I mentioned, seeing cities as complex systems should help to understand and predict urban growth. So it's a continuous development from the simple to the more complex here. I just came back from Singapore. As you know, last Monday I was here, then I was 1 week in Singapore, and so I'm still a bit jet lagged, but I hope I will be understandable today. The content of the lecture is we want to begin with a review of your exercises, and then we go to the complexity science definition, just one page, and then examples for cities as complex systems. And as an example of cities and speciality of cities, the cooler, calmer Singapore, and some conclusions. Let us start, though, with the exercise 2 review. And Danielle will bring it up. In general, you made very good exercises. Thank you. And as I mentioned last time, some of you even corrected the previous exercise based on the input that Danielle gave you. So that was much appreciated, and has also led to the improvement of the exercises. For today, we selected 3 examples, and if the people are here, it would be great. Otherwise, we just go through them. And we will point out a few special things. And as I said, it would be better if the person would be here, herself or himself. The author here? Is the author here? Who recognizes his design? No? Okay. Here, these are the 3 keynotes: health, resource, and identity as the criteria for livability. And then how this livability can be influenced in a negative way. The stocks and flows of pollution are quoted. Person is not here? Yes, I know that's you, but you don't want to talk about it, or it's still difficult? Maybe I know that the English is a bit difficult, and just correct me, okay, if I'm saying the wrong thing. But maybe we have one question to you. So you took the example of Beijing, of the great smog that now takes place in Beijing, as well as a sandstorm, combination of those. And because of the industries around the city, also because of this desertification in the nearby areas, where a great number of trees were cut down for money. And the problem is that the fog and the sandstorms are threatening everyone's health directly, and even during the majority of time when there is no fog, people still live under bad air conditions. So this is the interaction of something that's taking place in the city and outside of the city, between the climate and the city. So you have identified this flow correctly. Then you mentioned the stocks and flows of memory. Maybe you can say something to that.
Can you start over? Sorry.
Can you stand up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
For this topic, I think we cannot only think about the materials, substantials like pollutions on people and so that and etc. But also we should consider the memories and I think this kind of topics are also important in this consideration. And for example, in Beijing, every day there are so many old buildings being damaged or removed, and yeah, it's I think yeah, the memories, the characters of the city, I think is also an important aspect of the stocks and flows.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you very much. This is indeed a very important stock and flow. Just by accident, last week in Singapore, where there was a presentation of the future developments of the city, somebody from the audience, actually our future dean, Philipp Ursprung, he asked exactly this question. So where is the stock and flow of memory in the development for this new planning of a city? Of course, this is possible in Beijing, Beijing being one of the oldest cities in the world that is still in existence at the same place. But for new cities, that stock and flow is very important. The stock is probably not there because there was nothing before, but the flow of memory is still important. And then, of course, the stocks and flow of people. You describe the internal migration from the countryside in China into the big cities for the reason of striving for a better life. And the results being Beijing and the big cities being more crowded and the public transport system being overloaded. And the rise of housing prices. So this is something which we find in all countries, basically, where we have internal migration, but also migration from the outside with these connected items. But as you say here, these people do come striving for a better life, and that is what everybody is doing. What to do? So these are your ideas. New towns and old towns, or did you want to say own towns? This I don't understand. Is old towns or own towns?
Own towns, in my opinion, is the cities the people come from. Yeah, and they're not the developed areas all around China, and I think we can change the situations there and make it better, so the people will stay in their hometowns instead of coming to the new towns or directly to Beijing,
so
big city.
It's really own towns, their own towns. Okay, thank you. And then here, the flow of density. Can you also say something to that? The data. No, it stands for itself, so you have to read it. Then you focus on the transport, how to improve the transport, make the transport more smart, given the fact that the streets are already there. So you describe smart bus and metro routes and schedules, also smart traffic lights and signals, and the signals that communicate with each other and adapt. This is something that every city is trying to achieve these days. So that's certainly an important aspect. And the flow of position. The flow of position. Could you say something to that? This is an interesting concept.
I think in it's in this aspect, I talk about the flow of position, and as well as in the next page, the flow of intensity. Also, two important sides for the considering the ground and the ground the ground and the amount of people and the distribution of the people. And I think for the position, we can by using big data to analyze daily activities and distributions of the city, the people of the city in the city, and to modify and to optimize the for example infrastructure. For instance, the public transportation and the social service, and yeah.
Thank you. Then you also show some examples, minimum dwelling and scales and space, and this from an exhibition, from experiment here, and you give the references. So these are also graphically a quite nicely constructed exercise, and it's of course only one example of many. Let's look at the second one. And the second one is from Li Jinghan. Is here or not? No, not today. Well, then we go to it quickly. Focuses on Singapore as a livable city and asks, is Singapore really a livable city? He checks out the most livable locations globally for Asians, as it's called, and Singapore is number one. Then under happy Singaporeans, result of a survey, they say that the Singaporeans have the lowest positive emotions worldwide. Interestingly enough, that was also a topic in the conference last week that I was visiting or speaking at the World Architecture Festival. The chief architect of Singapore, who had built almost the entire city, more than 1 million apartments, he spoke of the same survey, and he didn't understand why people were not completely having positive emotions, whereas other countries like Panama, Paraguay, El Salvador, Venezuela had very positive emotions, the populations of these countries. He's then focusing on different stocks and flows, such as the food. The food waste is a very particular problem, of course, in that country, because Singapore doesn't grow anything in terms of food. Everything has to be imported. And as there's nothing grown, it's also not given back into the nature surrounding the city, so it has to be burned or somehow else destroyed, so the whole nutrient cycle of food is being destroyed in that. Then he talks about media censorship, because the different media are organized in a particular way, so the stocks and flows of information, he says, are limited by this effect. And he describes the urban canyons, stops and flows of density. This, of course, is not specific to Singapore, but to many other places as well. And in the urban canyons, as we know from many experiments and from reality and also from theory, the climatic conditions and the livability are radically different than from place in the countryside. So here he gives then the steps how to improve the urban canyon, and aspect ratio metric to improve the urban canyon. Again, these are some findings that were made to improve the conditions, climatic conditions in urban canyons, depending on which part of the world you are living in. And then he gives examples. So these are the sketches or the graphs that we were asking for. This is very interesting, and also the result in 3 dimensions, how the overlap or no overlap will have different effects. And finally, he makes some proposals for changes. As we can see here, Punggol is a specific site in Singapore, a new city in Singapore, quite interesting enough city the size of Zurich, which is totally built from scratch over the last years, which has a very specific way of living, and that contrasts to a downtown area in Singapore. He then makes the analysis of the different natural light penetration in these areas and comes up with the limitations and finally the bibliography. So that's quite an extensive analysis already. And another one. You're here? Okay, great. So we can talk to you a little bit. And in the meantime, Brigitte, could you also pull up Brigitte's in the background, okay?
What did you say? What did you say?
Brigitte's exercise. Yeah. Yeah. So, give the definition. And again, Singapore, so it shows that they have a comparison. Do you want to say a few words about this PSI, maybe, what it means?
I don't know exactly what PSI stands for, but it's to kind of measure how much pollutants there are in the sky. And like, as you know already, as what he mentioned last few weeks, that we were having haze in Singapore for like the last few months, and it changes over the time. So what our government actually does, that it has an online website where you will see this map, and you will know exactly where you stay on the island, and you will kind of know the higher the number, the more dense the pollutants are, and you can cross-reference it to the chart on the side. And if it becomes too unhealthy, you shouldn't be going out because it will clog your lungs. Yeah, and it's an irreversible process to your health. So yeah, this is like real time. So every few hours it changes again. So you always know what's going on around you. Yeah.
Right. So that's an example of a smart city that sensors measure the pollution and give you feedback, and the sensors don't keep that for themselves or for the city government, but they give it straight to the people. So that's a good example of a smart city feedback. Or the other one here, the smile, see me in line. Can you say something about this?
Yeah, this one is, I know the lame title, but we have like clinics all across Singapore, and like this is also an online portal where you can kind of find out which is the nearest and which is the least packed, because Singaporeans just hate to queue. So this actually gives you feedback, real-time feedback of how many people have registered at each of the clinics.
Right.
These are public clinics, so.
So you get that like an app. Anyone in this room has in her or his city a similar thing going on? The pollution ones, I think, is quite common now in certain cities which are suffering from pollution. But these are all new smart little applications that pop up everywhere. Then livable city, density, pollution, food, and recommendation. That was your sequence. So model livable high density city. That doesn't look like high density. Maybe you have to say what this is.
Which one?
This one here, the image on the right, because it's on top of high density,
yeah.
not by itself.
Yeah, this one is the famous resort hotel in Singapore. This is not really on the ground. It's a whole beach area infinity pool right on top of like a 50-story building. So it looks like it's not high density, but if you look right across, you can see how high densely populated the central business district is. And it's kind of the same like this throughout the whole of Singapore, just high rise everywhere.
Right. And then here you have the livability matrix, and you can see where Singapore is seen as a model for high density livable city. You see the other cities here going from Nairobi. On this scale, you have the urban population density on this axis, and on this axis, the livability as measured by the Mercer livability index. And here you have Singapore, London, Tokyo, Vancouver, and so on. Now, that of course is in strong contrast to the survey from Singapore we saw before with the happiness or being satisfied of the people. So that's an interesting conflict we see here. And the standard of living equals quality of life. There you bring up this question. And is that right that it's empty? No, there's a graph behind, right?
Yeah,
I saw that.
Yeah, that's
That
great.
didn't show up. It didn't show up.
It disappeared.
That's the other one.
Okay. So that is an important and good graph you have there. Unfortunately, not seeing. Then the density. This is a picture of the city. Is that Punggol, or which part of the city is it? No, it's another one.
I think this should be in the west side of Singapore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have the mass transit, and you see all the so-called HDBs, Housing Development Board apartments for people, where 80% of the population is living. And that was the gentleman who was speaking before me on last Wednesday in Singapore, New Thai Care. Maybe you have heard of him. He is the one who was the creator of more than 1 million of those apartments in the 1960s and 70s. So there you have the density, and this is quite high in these dark green areas. And here are the areas which is the central reservoir, and also the green land and the army land and the industry land down here. So this is this versus old versus new, or what did you want to say with this slide?
The one on the left is, if I can't remember, Toa Payoh, right? It's kind of like the old HDBs, which are like public housing, but you see that they kind of kept it at 4, kind of like what Jing Han was talking about. It keeps it short, and at the ground plane, there are shops that actually open and it's rather busy. But if you look at the one right on the right, it's the newest HDB, the tallest in the world, I think. It's almost 50 stories, residence, public housing.
Yeah.
And if you look at the ground level, there's literally nothing. It's sanitized. So what I was trying to show is like, does great density means that you result in a ground plane that is totally sanitized and has no activity, and therefore reduces livability of the city.
Right.
Yeah.
Considering that more than 6,000 people, I think, are living in that complex, and that most of the social spaces are elevated to the 20th or 40th or 60th floor, with huge platforms in between and on top of these buildings, that is the correct question that you're asking. Yes. Then the old kampung relationships, the history, that's the memory, stocks and flows of memory from the previous presentation that is still in people's minds towards this one here. And these are the same building on the top, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Then mixed-use developments across the island. This is a big topic now, that you combine different uses into one complex, into one high-density complex, and we have to see if this works in there. Then you give the example of the pollution, detrimental to health and to well-being, and you can see where the pollution is coming from at this time or at a certain time in other parts of the year. It's coming from the other direction. You know, it's not always from this direction, from the Java Sea. There's the PSI, the different examples, the pollution index, the wind conditions. These are all examples for measurements and sensors for the smart city. The National Environmental Agency is the agency that's giving that, publicizing this and making it available to the people. Then the food waste. Yeah.
Those PSI measurements, are
Yep.
they relevant? I mean, can we trust them? Because I know that I think like in Peking, for example, they also have them, but like the US embassy always have their own measurements, and they're like always higher than the one the government discloses.
Yes, I think in this case it is quite close to reality, because we did 2 years ago very extensive experiments and actually measurements walking through the streets with equipment between ETH and MIT. And we found, of course, in some places it's higher, in other places it's lower. But they take a certain reference in one of the parks, and from that they compare to the other sites. And these numbers, I think they're fairly precise. And also from having, unfortunately, experience with different PSI and haze conditions in all of these countries, I think they are pretty correct. But you know, last week, just before last week, it was up to 200, 300 again, so it was pretty bad.
Yeah, we were there during the seminar week.
Yeah.
It was just crazy.
Yeah, then it was even higher, yeah. But yes, we're running out of time, that's right. Sorry. Food waste, you give him food waste?
Sorry. What's your question?
That your concern, the food waste.
Oh yeah, because you can see it's quite a high percentage of our food is being wasted, but not really because we don't eat it, but a lot of it is actually because of like what they say aesthetic pruning of our vegetables, which we don't grow. And it's a big issue, I feel, for us, because we already don't produce our own food. And secondly, all these food are edible is wasted. And I was looking at also how Switzerland did it, like Co-op. And I didn't really understood what Co-op was doing with all that discounted action prices until I realized that it's a way of trying to get rid of food that are expiring, which we don't do that in Singapore, which I think it could be done in Singapore. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so you give different solutions for that, and then you come to the problem of food collection, learning from the Swiss food bike as bar, and recommendations. But just recently in the Swiss newspaper, an ETH study actually also said that more than half of the food being eaten in Switzerland, half the same amount is being destroyed before already. So this is a real big problem anywhere. Okay, so I think this is a good example, very extensive example. You made your point quite well, and it's nice to look at. So thank you. Congratulations to you and to many of the others as well. Do you want to say a few words about yours? Do you have to put it up? Or you cannot? Okay.
I can.
But it's late. Okay, so you are safe for this time. Okay, let's go back to the content of the course, because today is really complexity science, but it's good. Your exercises already show interdependencies that is totally relevant to this topic of complex systems. Complex systems, this is of course taken just from Wikipedia. Every one of you can copy this or look at this. They present problems both in mathematical modeling and philosophical foundation. The study of complex systems represents a new approach to science that investigates how relationships between parts give rise to collective behaviors of a system, and how the system interacts and forms relationships with its environment. And of course, if you think of a city, this is exactly what a city does as well. And that is exactly what each one of the stocks and flows in a city does. Then there are subfields that you can see here. It's hardly readable, but all these things also relate to a city. If you have heard about emergence, how suddenly certain neighborhoods emerge or certain forms emerge, how self-organization happens in a city between streets and people and so on. The collective behavior of people in a city, networks, evolution, adaptation, pattern formation. remember the pattern formation when we talked about the urban science and Christopher Alexander's writing, a city is not a tree, a city is this lattice, and so on. Systems theory, nonlinear dynamics, game theory, all these things happen also in a city. And therefore, although it was not invented as a science for the city or a representation of a city, complex systems and complexity science can very well be applied to the city, to the urban system. Now, let's have a look at cities as systems and cities as hierarchical systems and cities as complex systems. This is the development over time that has happened. I want to point your attention to one specific institute, the so-called Santa Fe Institute, where since more than a decade, the science of the city, and especially cities as complex systems, have been explored. And two of the people who are really exponents of this development are shown here in this video. One is called Jeffrey West, and the other one is Louis Betancourt.
The planet is now dominated by cities.
Both are
and it is becoming
physicists
very
originally
clear
and have
that the future
focused
of
their
humanity,
attention now on the city.
global sustainability itself, is now dependent on us having an understanding, a deep understanding of cities and urbanization.
You now have the greatest migration in history, where billions of people are choosing to come to cities.
To change their lives radically from what it traditionally was.
Look, historically, the hallmark of any civilization is cities. And in fact, some anthropologists and archaeologists have even said that cities, and I agree with them, cities are actually one of our main inventions. You know,
The fact that China and India are building hundreds of new cities. And this is going to have an enormous impact.
They're sort of the fastest, most spectacular social phenomenon that ever happened to our species, and perhaps
Ahead in the movie.
to biology on
Move
Earth.
ahead to about
there's lots of
two-thirds.
research done on cities.
About two-thirds.
There's lots of economists study cities, and sociologists, and anthropologists, and even psychologists.
Here?
Yeah,
And
about
the
that.
work that we are involved in
That allows you to basically.
So the next point is that they use complexity science
Effectively, in terms
to
of number of
predict
interactions speed
and
at time,
put
shrink time and
numerical
shrink space,
points on the
so that
development
you
of the
create
city.
essentially a social accelerator, a social concentrator of human activities.
So in biology, a network is your cardiovascular system, your
Think of
respiratory
Christopher
system, your renal
Alexander's city is
system.
not a tree.
Whereas in
story from
cities,
last time.
it's the roads, the electrical lines, the gas lines, but it is also the social networks of interaction between people and between groups of people. We believe that the reason we see these extraordinarily systematic behaviors in both biology and in social organization, cities, is because of the constraints of networks.
But there are specific ways in which cities can deviate from these averages as well, in terms, for example, of how well they do economically. These have a lot to do with their history and some of the self-reinforcing cycles.
The various historical events that took place, the multiple commissions of urban designers and architects, the role of the various mayors, the fact that the railroad may have suddenly come through.
So I think now that we have an increasingly clear picture about what cities look like quantitatively, in terms of their statistics, in terms of how much they can vary from this idealized generic city, I think what's missing now is to have a mathematical description that's predictive of what creates these patterns that we see in the data.
The science of cities means that in addition to just qualitative understanding of a city, that the structure, dynamics, organization, evolution, growth can all be put in a mathematizable way, quantitatively and therefore predictively.
Okay, let's
So the
stop
only
there.
way to understand all this together is to understand how these different aspects.
Thank you. So this is exactly the point where in the Future Cities Laboratory in Singapore and in other places and in the Santa Fe Institute, the opinions start to diverge. Because here you just heard that there's a certain belief or hope that through numerical specification, through specification in the system, in the complex system, the accountability and the predictability of cities can be guaranteed. And this is, of course, something that other people vehemently object to because of all these other qualities of complex systems, which are emergence and so on. But it is a very interesting debate, and I really can recommend, look at the papers at the different parts that are listed in the Santa Fe Institute, where the impact of scale of a city on the livability of a city, on the economic production of a city, on the crime of a city, and so on, is related. And we find indeed very, very strong mathematical correlations between the size of a city, the scale of a city, and all of these factors. When they were talking about these different aspects, they were, of course, talking about the stocks and flows, if you remember those stocks and flows from the past. The grandfather, if you want, of the cities as complex systems, who has written and talked about this a lot in recent decades, I must say, is Michael Batty. He's from the University College London and the CASA Institute that I also already mentioned before, from the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis. And he says something quite important, reading, cities have been treated as systems for 50 years, but only in the last 2 decades, that is now since the mid-90s, has the focus changed from aggregate equilibrium systems to more evolving systems. Do you know what equilibrium systems are and how they're employed in city simulation? Have you heard about this before? No? Okay, so in a nutshell is you try to explain a city, but looking mostly at stable city or stable developments or predictable developments. And the ideas or the theory is that they all want to reach a certain equilibrium. And this is a very strong development in city simulation in the past century, we must say. So that was the step they started from. And now these equilibrium systems go to more evolving systems whose structure merges from the bottom up. So that is the development of this institute they have gone through. They do wonderful work. They do a lot of research. They take very practical cases like here, London, in the 1991 census, the population density on the left, and the evolution of the road network over the last 500 years from the center outwards. And you can see here from the red color how it developed really from the center outwards. And with this, you can explain both from fractal theory, but also from the equilibrium theory. In future direction, Michael Batty says something quite important. The move from articulating systems as organized entities, structured from the top down, based on some sort of centralized control mechanisms. And this is exactly the approach that, for example, Singapore took in the construction and building of the city. Based on some centralized control, to systems that grow in an uncoordinated way from the bottom up, like we see it in many places just next to Singapore, for example, in Jakarta or in Rangoon or in other cities in the neighborhood or in African cities, and previously in European cities or North American cities. Model in a parsimonious way to developing much richer models requiring more detailed data. So that's the link to the big data. In short, complexity theory has changed the basis for theory and model selection from an insistence that all models must be testable against data to an So that, of course, is shaking the very foundations of science, because in science you should be able to test every theory, everything that you have done, every prototype against data which are coming up later. But the system of a city being so complex, this is basically impossible. But Michael Batty, he has really a lot of experience, is one of the leaders worldwide in this field, comes to this conclusion that science and urban science and complexity urban science will develop in this direction. We here at the chair have a quite similar approach, but we're asking many questions. We're asking ourselves, can a complexity science informed an evidence-based planning process using advanced simulation and design synthesis methods lead to more sustainable urban structures? That is our main question, because of course we want to have more sustainable urban structures and more resilient urban structures. So this is the other question. Can complexity science inform an evidence-based planning processes supported by an advanced simulation and design synthesis methods lead to more resilient urban structures? Resilient meaning that these structures, these urban centers and urban systems can survive catastrophes in an elegant and good way, so that afterwards they're stronger than before. And we look at this in a historic perspective that you also saw expressed in the writings before, that development of the view of a city causes certain conflicts. If we go back many, many years, maybe 2,000 years, 3,000 years, from what we can see today, it was pretty much a geometry-driven planning approach, that people were drawing in the sand or on pergament or paper later certain geometric things that they knew of, and this geometry could be handed over to the builders that built the houses and everything accordingly. So the geometry was the thing that connected everything, and because the geometry was so important, then all the buildings had a certain equal or similar look, also supported by the reduction of material that was available. Then we came to an area of sequential planning, then functional planning, then urban science emerged. This is now the 1950s, 1960s, and now since the 80s, 90s, complexity science informed urban design, and now the point that we are at, where we're just moving from complexity science informed urban design, which is still relatively structured, to the big data informed design, which is a complete, not complete, but which is a break and a further development of all the previous ones. And the conflict comes out of this. Still, when we design, or many people when they design, see that as a completely separate or almost isolatable action by themselves, maybe sometimes in conjunction with other people, but it's a very special process that can be defined and described. And this development, as we see here, goes more and more into a process of analysis, that you have so many data, out of which then, by evidence, you can automatically deduce the future. It's a little bit already in the sentence that Betancourt said at the end, and Jeffrey West said at the end, that the predictability of the development of a city is there. So that is a conflict from design to analysis, where analysis becomes the design 2.0, maybe, perhaps, we don't know. We have been going into this very deeply in the research here at the chair. Unfortunately, time is over there again, so we have to lock it up for the next lecture. We have here all these things I don't want to go through now. Just want to come to the conclusions. See all the things you are missing here. And all of this has already the second time been shifted to the back. This is terrible. So you see it in very compressed form here again. But we come to the conclusions. These were the things I was also talking about in Singapore last week, and I have much more feedback now from the people who are directly hit by this development. And I hope we will be able to show it eventually. And I come to the conclusion. So, complexity science, as this new type of science, should help to understand and predict urban systems' behavior. I say systems behavior. Some people say the systems in themselves. Predict the systems, the growth of the system, behavior of the systems in themselves. I wouldn't go so far at this moment, because prediction is a pretty strong word. The development began by seeing cities, or realizing or modeling cities as systems. That's a quite old approach, but a very valid approach. Then as top-down organized hierarchical systems. remember again, Christopher Alexander, city as a tree, as a misconception. But quite interesting, again, in this big talk in Singapore last week by this big architect, the city architect, he very much described the city planning, the ideal city planning, as such a organized hierarchical system approach. And now, more recently, as complex systems, that we see systems as cities as more as complex systems. Our conclusion here at the chair, and also many people who work in this field, this view explains much post factum about city, but it reinforces the essential role of the urban design, of the architect, of the urban designer, and, as we discussed last time, possibly and most likely also of the future citizen design scientists. And that is hopefully you. And with that, I want to stop. We will give you your exercise probably towards the end of the week, and then you have time to do the exercise until the end of the semester. So with that, I want to stop and wish you a beautiful afternoon. Thank you.